Last year, South Korea experienced a tragic aviation accident that captured widespread attention through various videos and discussions. Today, we revisit another devastating air disaster that occurred 40 years ago during the Cold War. In the early hours of September 1, 1983, Korean Airlines Flight 007, a Boeing 747-230B, was shot down by a Soviet Su-15 fighter jet over Soviet airspace. The plane crashed into the open sea southwest of Monern Island, killing all 269 passengers and crew on board. This incident, set against the backdrop of a tense historical period, had profound and far-reaching consequences. For a long time, the truth surrounding the tragedy remained shrouded in mystery. The Soviet Union claimed the aircraft was a spy plane, while U.S. President Ronald Reagan accused the Soviets of deliberately targeting a civilian flight. It wasn't until 1992, when Russian President Boris Yeltsin declassified 5 secret memorandums related to the incident and handed over the black box of Flight 007 to South Korea, that the full story finally came to light. The year 1983 marked one of the most intense phases of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, even surpassing the Cuban Missile Crisis of the 1960s. President Reagan, known for his tough stance on the Soviet Union, labeled it the evil empire, and frequently provoked Soviet sensitivities in the military arena. Initiatives like the Strategic Defense Initiative, often referred to as Star Wars, were interpreted as preparations for full-scale warfare. The U.S. also planned the deployment of Pershing II missiles in Europe and conducted massive naval exercises in the North Pacific in March, heightening fears in the Kremlin of a potential nuclear strike. Soviet military districts were placed on high alert, conducting multiple exercises in response. During these drills, U.S. military aircraft frequently flew over the Soviet Kuril Islands and other sensitive installations. Some commanders in the Soviet Far East Air Defense Force faced reprimands or were dismissed for failing to act decisively, leading to the dominance of hardliners within the military. Against this backdrop, Korean Airlines Flight 007 departed from New York's John F. Kennedy Airport on August 31 at 1:00 p.m., bound for Gimpo Airport in Seoul. The flight was commanded by Captain Chun Byung-yong, a former South Korean Air Force pilot with over 10,000 hours of flight experience. He had previously served as a backup pilot for the presidential aircraft used by former South Korean President John Doo-hwan. At 8:30 p.m., the aircraft made a scheduled stop in Anchorage, Alaska, for refueling and took off again at 10:00 p.m. However, shortly after takeoff, the plane began to deviate from its planned route. Air traffic control issued no warnings, and while the deviation appeared minor on navigation charts, even a slight miscalculation can lead to catastrophic consequences. At 12:51 a.m. on September 1, Soviet air defense radar detected Flight 007 over the northeastern Kamchatka Peninsula. At the time, U.S. RC-135 reconnaissance aircraft frequently operated in the area, and one such plane had been active earlier that evening. Mistaking the Korean airliner for an American reconnaissance aircraft, the Soviets took action. The RC-135 bore a strong resemblance to a civilian jetliner in appearance. By 1:30 a.m., Flight 007 had entered the restricted airspace over the Kamchatka Peninsula, home to Soviet missile silos and a designated no-fly zone. For Soviet fighter jets were scrambled to intercept the aircraft. Complicating the situation, a critical early warning radar station on the Kamchatka Peninsula had been damaged by strong winds 10 days earlier. To avoid repercussions, the station's commander falsely reported that the radar had been repaired, leaving the region vulnerable. At 2:28 a.m., Flight 007 exited Kamchatka's airspace and entered the Sea of Okhotsk. 8 minutes later, it approached Sakhalin Island, home to a highly classified Soviet strategic submarine base. The Soviet Far East Air Defense Forces 11th Army deployed 3 Su-15s and 1 MiG-23 to intercept the intruding aircraft. At 3:08 a.m., an Su-15 pilot, Gennady Osipovich, spotted the airliner but had difficulty identifying its type due to the darkness. Approaching for a closer visual inspection, Osipovich later recalled that he recognized it as a civilian airliner but noted that its window blinds were drawn, making it impossible to see if there were passengers on board. During the Cold War, it was not uncommon for civilian aircraft to be repurposed for military use. The Soviet fighters attempted to issue warning shots, but lacking tracer rounds, they resorted to firing 200 cannon rounds. The airliner showed no response, possibly due to the darkness obscuring the warning shots. At 3:23 a.m., the plane suddenly climbed, a maneuver later attributed to fuel conservation. However, the Soviet pilot interpreted this as an attempt to evade capture, as the aircraft was minutes away from leaving Soviet airspace. Seeking authorization to engage, the Far East Air Defense Commander, General Valery Kamensky, insisted on confirming the plane was not a civilian airliner before taking action. Nevertheless, his subordinate, Major General Anatoly Kornikov, the commander of Dolinsk Sokol Air Base and later the Russian Air Force chief, argued that the aircraft had already traversed sensitive areas, including missile installations and the Sakhalin submarine base. He deemed it irrelevant whether the plane was civilian or military, ordering its immediate downing. At 3:25 a.m., Osipovich fired two R-8 air-to-air missiles from his Su-15. One missile missed, but the other struck the tail of Flight 007, damaging its hydraulic and electrical systems. 13 minutes later, the crippled aircraft crashed into the open sea southwest of Monarch Island, killing all 269 people on board. The Soviet Union's handling of the incident was influenced by the poor health of its leader, Yuri Andropov, at the time. Following the advice of Defense Minister Dmitry Ustinov, Soviet officials initially denied responsibility, despite objections from the Foreign Ministry. However, the magnitude of the event made it impossible to conceal. Within hours, the White House held a press conference revealing intercepted Soviet communications and condemning the attack. 4 days later, the Soviet Union admitted to shooting down the Korean airliner but framed it as a deliberate provocation by the United States, alleging that Flight 007 was on a spy mission. They claimed the aircraft had penetrated over 600 kilometers into Soviet airspace, ignored radio communications, and failed to comply with fighter jet instructions. While expressing regret for the loss of life, the Soviets refused to apologize or offer compensation. Their subsequent search and investigation efforts were minimal and uncooperative, drawing widespread condemnation and leaving the Soviet Union diplomatically isolated. According to declassified documents released by President Yeltsin, the Soviets had located the wreckage of Flight 007 on the seabed by September 15 and recovered the black box on October 20. The flight data and cockpit recordings revealed that the airliner had strayed off course due to the pilot's failure to engage standard navigation procedures after takeoff. Air traffic control also failed to issue warnings, and Soviet fighter pilots never attempted radio communication with the plane, mistakenly identifying it as a spy aircraft. Ultimately, a combination of the pilot's oversight, air traffic control errors, and misjudgments by Soviet military personnel, compounded by the heightened tensions of the Cold War, culminated in this tragic disaster. In its aftermath, U.S. President Ronald Reagan announced that certain GPS functionalities would be made available for civilian use, while the Soviet Union issued strict orders prohibiting the shooting down of non-military aircraft without authorization from the Air Defense Forces commander or the Minister of Defense. This new directive created hesitancy within Soviet air defense units. This hesitancy became apparent during the infamous Red Square incident on May 28, 1987, when a young West German amateur pilot named Matthias Rust managed to fly a rented light aircraft from Hamburg, through Iceland and Finland, and over 1,000 kilometers into Soviet airspace, landing in the heart of Moscow's Red Square. Although Soviet air defenses had detected Rust's flight, rigid command structures and strict orders prevented a timely response. Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev seized upon the incident to restructure the military, replacing Defense Minister Sergei Sokolov, Air Force Commander Alexander Koldanov, and over 200 other senior officers with his own appointees. And with that, today's story comes to an end. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to our channel.